Wars. Released back in 2008, The Clone Wars is a series that has impacted the Star Wars brand in more ways than any of us can count. Not only did many of us grow up with this show, but the show's legacy remains strong 15 years after the first season concluded. Characters, locations, and even concepts have appeared throughout various other Star Wars mediums. In this 7-part video series, I'm going to go through each of the seasons of Star Wars The Clone Wars and analyze the many aspects of them. From the characters, to the arcs, to the creators, to the production, I'm going to cover as much as I can. Even after the series concluded back in 2020, there is still so much to discuss. So let's travel back in time to 2005 and look at the production of Star Wars The Clone Wars. All the way back in April of 2005, at the 3rd ever Star Wars celebration, George Lucas first announced that Lucasfilm was working on a 3D continuation of the pilot series that was on the Cartoon Network. A few years prior to that, a miniseries titled Star Wars Clone Wars, not to be confused with Star Wars The Clone Wars, was released on Cartoon Network. Since Revenge of the Sith had not yet been released, Lucas focused a lot of his efforts on a multimedia project surrounding the events that followed Attack of the Clones, aka The Clone Wars. This included books, comics, games, and of course the Cartoon Network miniseries. Many have fond memories of this miniseries, but since the series in its entirety only ran for 2 hours and 14 minutes, Clone Wars was only able to scratch the surface of what the Clone Wars actually were. So fast forward a few years following the release of Revenge of the Sith, George Lucas was finally free to fully pursue this new 3D animated project. When Lucas began writing the Star Wars prequels back in the mid to late 90s, he clearly had a vision for not only the story of Anakin Skywalker, but also what this entire era of Star Wars would look like. He had the task of taking one line about the Clone Wars from the original film,
"You fought in the Clone Wars?"
and actually turning the Clone Wars into a war. His vision for this era of Star Wars was so massive that it would simply not be possible to include it all in just a single trilogy. So once the trilogy concluded, it was time to take those ideas out of his head and put them to the big screen, or I guess the small screen. In an interview during the release of the Clone Wars movie in 2008, Lucas spoke about how the Clone Wars was going to focus less on the story of Anakin Skywalker and more on the actual war. And that 3D animation was the perfect medium for all of that. Even though Lucas was in charge, he hired Dave Filoni as the lead showrunner for the series. Filoni began his career working as a storyboard artist and an assistant director on multiple animated shows. King of the Hill, Timo Supremo, and Kim Possible are some of the projects he worked on early in his career. Eventually, Filoni became a lead director on multiple episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Season 1 of Avatar was a major success for Nickelodeon, and because of this success, George Lucas reached out to Filoni to become the showrunner for The Clone Wars. Filoni accepted and production began. Unlike Avatar: The Last Airbender, Star Wars The Clone Wars would not be a linear show that followed a central group of characters. The Clone Wars would be an anthology series, a show that would follow multiple different characters and multiple different storylines from episode to episode. Because this show's main focus was expanding the story of the Clone Wars, it wouldn't really make sense to follow a single storyline. This gave Lucas and Filoni the freedom to basically tell whatever story they wanted. If they wanted to tell a story about clones in some random mass outpost, they could do that. If they wanted to tell the story of Newt Gunray getting captured by the Republic and then escaping, they could do that. If they wanted to introduce new characters and have them killed off in the same episode, they could do that. Because there were so many possibilities for stories that could be told, Lucas needed a real fan at the helm of the series, and that's why Filoni was a perfect fit. Now, based on recent Star Wars shows, you may know that just because someone says they're a Star Wars fan, that doesn't automatically mean they're a good fit to be a showrunner. But there's a difference between someone who loves Star Wars and someone who's a huge nerd about it. I'm not trying to say one fan is better than the other, by the way, but when it comes to obscure Star Wars knowledge, Filoni was your guy. The reason someone like this worked so well for the Clone Wars was was because the Clone Wars is not its own story. As much as we may love the show, it's totally reliant on the events of the prequel trilogy. This show does not work if the prequel films don't exist. So since this show is pretty much a companion to that trilogy of films, why not hire a guy who has all the passion in the world to elaborate on the most minute aspects of those films? Filoni was such a Star Wars nerd that he and Lucas would often have debates about the semantics of certain things and what they could or couldn't do. My favorite example of this is the story of Filoni and Lucas arguing about whether or not Plo Koon should be able to fight in space.
George always made fun of us because he said, I made 6 films without having anybody fight in space. And I said, yeah, but Grievous got sucked out into space and then walked on the top of the cruiser. George is like, well, he's a robot. And I was like, no, he's not. He's cyborg.
Filoni's passion for Star Wars bleeds through every episode of the Clone Wars, and there are so many examples of this, like Filoni taking the Gundark mentioned in The Empire Strikes Back and giving it an entire fight sequence. There are also plenty of unused concepts from the movies that Filoni included in this first season. Filoni even dug deeper than just the films. The Blue Shadow virus was something that he thought of after reading some of the Star Wars comics, and the maneuver that Ahsoka pulls with the Star Destroyer in the episode Storm over Ryloth was something he pulled straight from Heir to the Empire.
And Grand Admiral Thrawn uses a very similar technique of turning his Star Destroyer on its side to lure the enemy in, thinking that the Star Destroyer is vulnerable.
An animated show is perfect for all these little bits of fan service that Filoni included in the show. A live action show like Ahsoka may not be the perfect place for this, but the Clone Wars was. Now, just because Filoni was such a big fan, that doesn't automatically mean everything is going to be great. After seeing the first few episodes, Lucas claimed that the episodes were so good that he had to release them as a theatrically released film. And well, that was a terrible idea. The film was panned critically, and rightfully so. It turns out taking the first few episodes and just making them a movie is not such a good idea. Despite such poor film reviews, however, the film did gross $68 million on a budget of only $8.5 million, so it wasn't a total failure. The critical backlash to the film didn't stop the production of the series, however. On October 3rd, 2008, the first 2 episodes of Season 1 of Star Wars The Clone Wars were released on Cartoon Network. So, how did the season turn out? Well, let's dive deep into the contents of Season 1, shall we? As I hinted at before, what is the #1 goal of Star Wars The Clone Wars? Sure, you can say its main goal is to be good, but I'm trying to get at something a bit more specific. The goal of The Clone Wars is to expand on the prequels. This series is a companion to the prequels, and Lucas wants it to explore the many aspects of this world that the films could not. Thankfully, this is where the series as a whole excels. Season 1, more than most seasons, really focuses on developing the broader strokes of the war, while the later seasons will focus on more specific aspects of the war. Right off the bat with Season 1, we are shown new worlds, how they look, and maybe most importantly, how they're affected by the Clone Wars. With the Rhodia episode, for example, we are told that the people are struggling and that the reason they're aligning with the Separatists is because they're offering aid that the Republic is not. Outside of Rhodia, we have other worlds like Ryloth and how their situation is far more dire than Rhodia's. And we even explore the least developed cultures like the Lurmen and how their isolationist and pacifist views are a key part of their identity. We even get to see the different philosophies of the leaders within these respective cultures. And this doesn't just apply to Rhodia, the Lurmen, or Ryloth. Now, we don't really get a look into what the Rhodian culture is like, but we absolutely do with the Lurmen and the Twi'leks. Of course, not every episode looks into new and unique cultures, but a fair amount of them do, and that's important when it comes to expanding the Clone Wars. In other episodes like the Gungan General, we see other senators and what their beliefs are. By the way, Senator Karras from that episode has the staff of Ra from Indiana Jones. We get a good look at the staff when he's buried, and yeah, it's the same one. Now, going back to the many worlds of the Clone Wars, sure, they all look different, but I'm far more interested in their role within the Clone Wars. I especially like how in the episode Mystery of 1,000 Moons, we get to see a world that was completely abandoned by the Separatists. Another neat detail that Filoni added here, these angels that we see are are supposedly the same angels that Anakin references when he first meets Padme all the way back in The Phantom Menace. So yeah, a lot of these moments are little bits of fan service, but because the Clone Wars wants to expand the universe, actually showing things that were briefly mentioned in movies is a good idea. Now, other than introducing us to new worlds or new cultures or new species, the show introduces us to a variety of new characters. Of course, there's Ahsoka, who I'll touch on later, but I'm more so talking about really small characters. Like we meet a new Jedi in Nadar, a former Padawan of Kit Fisto. The season even makes an effort to highlight how different the younger Jedi are from the older Jedi and how the war has affected them. In the season finale, we meet a handful of new bounty hunters like Cad Bane. During the middle of the season, we meet a handful of pirates, most notably fan favorite Hondo Ohnaka. Now, these aren't specifically new characters, but we also meet a handful of new droids too, not just the ones we saw in the films. From characters like Nadar to Cad Bane to Hondo, each one is different from the other, and they all highlight a different aspect of this world. Season 1 doesn't specifically spend much time with each one of these characters, but simply introducing us to these characters allows the world to expand in ways the prequels never did. Now, while Season 1 did introduce us to a lot of new stuff, where the season was actually strongest was with how it handled the background characters from the prequels. It was such a brilliant choice to take these no-named Jedi from the movies and devote entire episodes to them. Plo Koon was just some random-ass Jedi, but in the Clone Wars, a whole episode is devoted to him, an episode that gives him personality and characteristics. Since he never spoke in the films, Filoni and his team had to decide how they wanted him to speak, which is such an interesting dilemma to figure out. Along with Plo Koon, the season gave us an episode on Luminara, Kit Fisto, Aayla Secura, and even Yoda to an extent. Of course, we already know so much about Yoda, but let's be real, the prequel films didn't give him much to do. He was nothing like he was in the original trilogy. So devoting the pilot episode to Yoda and have him teach the clones these different life lessons was a wise choice, actually. Even the more minor villains like Grievous or even more minor Wat Tambor get some development. When watching the featurettes of the series, it's so funny to see the leads look at one completely minor character from the films and then deciding to devote an entire episode to that character. One thing you can never criticize Lucas for is that he knows his audience. He knows that season 1 of an animated show on Cartoon Network is not going to be for 30-year-olds. This show was for the kids who just grew up with the prequels a few years before and are still growing up now. So many of us who watched the Clone Wars from the beginning were the kids that bought the visual dictionaries and memorized all the random ass facts about the movies. We were the kids that would say, "Hey mom, you see that ugly green alien? His name is Kit Fisto." Now imagine how excited that kid got when that ugly green alien had a whole episode devoted to him. Little things like that is how Lucas and Filoni were able to build such a loyal fan base with this show. They know that an animated show on Cartoon Network doesn't need to be the next Game of Thrones. It was a show for young Star Wars fans and they leaned into that. Now I can talk about the worlds or these minor characters that were expanded upon, but I need to highlight what was without a doubt the biggest accomplishment of this show. And this is something I'm going to elaborate on with each season of the Clone Wars, and that's how this show built on the clones themselves. In the second episode of the season, when Plo Koon is thinking of ways to rescue everyone, one of the clones says, "We're just clones, sir," and Plo Koon responds by telling them they're more than that. This little exchange is pretty much the thesis for the entire show. In the movies, the clones were basically no different than the droids, mindless killing machines. But in the Clone Wars, the clones are so much more than that. Rookies is the most popular episode from season 1, and it's easy to understand why. The episode develops the clones better than any other episode this season. We meet so many new clones, some whose time is short-lived like Heavy, and others who play critical roles throughout the series like Echo and Fives. Echo was introduced all the way back when this episode came out in 2008, and in 2024 with the Bad Batch, he's still an important character. That's how great of a job this show did with the clones. The show gave these clones so much personality. They watch these holograms when they're bored, and they even have this art of sexy girls on the wall. It's such a minor thing, but it's realistic. I also love how they have nicknames for each other, like Shinies. Outside of the episode Rookies, I loved the episode on Ryloth where we see the clones with a stranded little Twi'lek girl. Filoni said this episode was so important to him because he really wanted to highlight the empathy of these clones. And it turns out Innocence of Ryloth was one of the best episodes of the season for that reason. Season 1 may not dive as deep into the clones as future seasons will, but it was certainly a great start. Now, I can continue talking about all all the positives of this season. But I still think most of us can agree season 1 of the Clone Wars was the weakest season of the show. And a big reason why is because it suffers a lot from first season syndrome. Filoni and the others were clearly still figuring out what worked and what didn't work. That results in a lot of these episodes in the season to be either quite pointless or quite repetitive. So many of these episodes can be summarized like this. A conflict arises on an independent world, the Separatists start doing evil stuff, the Republic comes to save the independent world, and the world either joins the Republic or remains independent. This happens like 5 times throughout the season. So many of these episodes are also devoted to finding Grievous, which we know isn't going to happen anyways, so it's a strange thing to center so many of your episodes around. The biggest offense when it comes to what this season repeats are the comically evil villains. In the opening monologue of the Blue Shadow Virus episode, they refer to the Separatists as a Separatist rebellion.
As the Separatist rebellion rages through the galaxy.
The whole reason this conflict exists is supposedly because so many systems were tired of the Republic and wanted to secede. That's an interesting dilemma to base a war on. When it comes to the conflict we see in the show, however, at least in this season, all the Separatists are comically evil. Yeah, we already knew Newt Gunray was not a great dude from the movies, but in the show, he's openly evil to the people he's supposedly recruiting to the Separatists. In the episode Defenders of Peace, the main villain Locke Durd creates a weapon that he describes as a weapon that can cause catastrophic destruction, and in order to test that weapon, he wants to wipe out an innocent village. When that doesn't work, he then orders the droids to kill all the villagers anyway. In the Blue Shadow Virus episodes, this scientist wants to create a virus that can wipe out the entire population of a planet. In the Ryloth arc, Wat Tambor is enslaving Twi'leks for his own personal gain. In fact, he's so comically evil that you can see him stealing the Ark of the Covenant, just like the Germans did in a certain World War II movie. The point I'm trying to make is not that this is all unrealistic. Of course it's realistic. It's just that the Separatists are not all evil people trying to commit war crimes constantly. Yes, Palpatine and Dooku, the people manipulating this whole conflict, are evil, but I'd assume a majority of Separatists just want to fight a rebellion for freedom, just like the rebels in the original trilogy. I'm not saying the Separatists were in the right. What I'm saying is that the conflict Lucas created in the prequels was more three-dimensional than this. Both sides had good intentions, but were run by evil people who were willing to exploit the lives of billions for power. If you just watched season 1 of the Clone Wars, you'd think the Republic are all the good guys and the Separatists are all the bad guys. So this expansion of the Clone Wars didn't expand on the conflict that was established in the films all that well. It also doesn't help the season that each one of these horrific villains are defeated every single time. Whether it be the recurring villains or one of the new villains, they always lose. That's why Cad Bane was such a refreshing character to conclude the season on, because for one, he wasn't comically evil, but more importantly, he actually won and posed a real threat to our heroes. So besides Cad Bane, the villains and the Separatists in the season were a huge letdown. Now, what the Clone Wars eventually becomes well known for is how it tackles mature themes. So many of these arcs later in the show are more thought-provoking than almost anything I've seen in animation. Season 1 doesn't come close to the level of depth that the later seasons have. One of the big themes of this show is supposedly the horrors of war, and while we get a little bit of that in season 1, most of it still portrays war as being a lot of fun. A lot of these episodes, like the Rhodia episode, introduce an interesting topic, but then it just turns into a simple rescue mission episode. It's not as focused on the themes yet. In the episode Defenders of Peace, it touches on how the innocent suffer in war, but then everything is good in the end and the people move on. With the Talls in the episode Trespass, they introduce this concept of the Pantorans thinking they're a primitive species not worthy of the same rights. But the way it's all resolved is that the counselor just dies and then peace is made. That's not the most interesting way to explore that theme. Biological warfare was introduced in the Blue Shadow Virus arc, but it's treated as any other conflict the Jedi need to solve. Now, there are some examples of this show exploring more mature themes in an effective way. The episode with Nadar effectively showed how war can change people. Kit Fisto hinted that Nadar was once a more peaceful and level-headed person, but we saw how his aggression led him to losing his way. During the Lerman arc, I really liked Ahsoka questioning the difference between attachment and compassion. It's a great bit of development for a character that we'll discuss in a bit. Going back to the Blue Shadow Virus episodes, there were some interesting questions raised about how to handle such a devastating virus. Do you sacrifice the few to ensure the safety of the many? Granted, the characters were never forced into making this decision, but the questions were still interesting nonetheless. The whole Ryloth arc handled the subjects of innocence and radicals far better than any other part of the season. As I stated before, showing the innocence of a little girl and contrasting that with her surroundings is powerful stuff. Cham raising questions about power vacuums once the Separatists are defeated was a prophecy that became true. The best the season got with interrogating these themes was with Ahsoka in the first Ryloth episode. Struggling with the loss of so many men is a prominent theme in war, and seeing a teenage girl deal with this, along with how Anakin handles that as a teacher, was powerful for me. All these years later, it makes me think back to the Ahsoka series and what the show tried to convey with Ahsoka's arc. Speaking of Ahsoka and her arc, it's time to talk about the main characters of the show, and that's really just Anakin and Ahsoka. It's peculiar that when promoting the show, Lucas put an emphasis on how much he didn't want the show to focus on Anakin, but the show is still largely about Anakin. Ahsoka is arguably the main character, and the biggest part of her story is her relationship with her master. But putting that to the side for the moment, I am mostly pleased with how this show and even this season grew these characters. In the Clone Wars movie, Ahsoka was annoying, and she is a little bit here in season 1, especially during the Battle of the Droids two-parter, but after those episodes, the storytellers do a solid job of getting us to buy into Ahsoka after not liking her initially, and they do this by giving her so many flaws. A lot of these flaws are because she is trying to mirror Anakin. She is brash and impulsive like Anakin. We saw this in her dynamic with Luminara. She makes so many impulsive decisions, some work out and some don't. But what makes us endear Ahsoka is that she's always asking questions, always trying to learn, and even when she does hold her ground, it's not in an arrogant way. And she's also quick to admit she's wrong. I mentioned this earlier, but I loved the moment between her and Aayla Secura where she questions the difference between attachment and compassion, or in the following episode when she questions how these people can refuse to fight for their own safety. These qualities that Ahsoka has can endear us to a person. Ahsoka exudes compassion but also naivety, and that works perfect for a main character in a kids show. The best Ahsoka moments are without a doubt the parts where she is put in command during Storm over Ryloth. We see her being too reckless, but when things go south, we see how much she struggles with this. She loses her confidence, she feels guilty about letting others down, and we see how much the clones matter to her. These are flaws that audiences can latch onto and relate to. Inevitably, Anakin puts his faith in her, and we see how uneasy this makes Ahsoka initially, but she seizes the moment, doesn't run away, and leads her people to victory. This was a great arc to give a season 1 Ahsoka. Ahsoka was put in command, she struggled with it, she suffered the consequences of her actions, and she learned what it really meant to lead. Great arc for Ahsoka and a great rebound from how she was in the movie. When it comes to her counterpart in Anakin, sorry prequel fans, but I love this version of the character so much more than the movie version. Now there are some interesting questions that need to be raised. From a canonical perspective, how can the Anakin from Attack of the Clones turn into this version of Anakin? It's almost as if they're two completely different people, and I get this criticism. If you're someone who relates deeply with the movie version of Anakin, it makes sense why you wouldn't love this version of the character. But how I see it is that Filoni looked at the movie Anakin, took notes on everything that people disliked about him, and vowed to change it in his show. He's a lot less whiny, he's a great leader, he's not a creep, his relationship with Obi-Wan feels real. Show Anakin is a far more engaging character. Certain characteristics like his leadership, his recklessness, his empathy, it's all conveyed so much better in the show. The little moments where Anakin taps into the dark side were handled better here than they were in the movies as well. In Attack of the Clones, it just felt more like a tantrum. During the Blue Shadow virus arc, seeing Anakin tap into the dark side at the thought of losing Padme felt a lot like a younger Vader. The show also does a good job at showing how Anakin is not Superman. He's human too. We see how injured he gets during the Lerman episodes, and even in the season finale, he loses a brief fight with Cad Bane. Now, I'm not saying the films didn't do this. We literally saw Anakin getting barbecued alive. It's just important that the show didn't treat Anakin like a superhero, which they didn't. Anakin's relationship with Obi-Wan was one of my larger criticisms of the movies. That should have been the main focus of the prequel films. The bond between master and apprentice and how devastating it was when Anakin turned to the dark side. But in the first movie, they share maybe 2 scenes together. In the second movie, all they do is complain about each other. And then in the third movie, they spend most of it apart from each other. Getting to actually see Anakin's relationship with Obi-Wan was so refreshing. The banter the two had when they were captured with Count Dooku was some hilarious stuff. And even seeing how the two handled conflict like in the Pantorian Mandalorian episode was great. Each season continues to build on this relationship, and that's something I'm so grateful for. Now, I will give Clone Wars critics this. It is hard to believe that a few months after Attack of the Clones, the Jedi would give Anakin a Padawan. I love their dynamic, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't trade it for anything, but it is a bit peculiar from a lore perspective. Season 1 did a lot of things well, but also there were a lot of things they needed to improve on. But guess what? They were actually allowed the time to improve. Everyone agrees that the seasons mostly get better as the show progresses, but I can't help but wonder if the Clone Wars would have been cancelled after season 1 if it came out today. We live in a climate where so much is put at stake in the first season, and when it doesn't become the next Breaking Bad, it gets cancelled. Throughout this video, I've referenced the featurettes a lot. Sure, they're fun to watch if you want to learn random facts, but what I found so much more interesting was listening to Filoni and the others talk about their faults and their limitations with this show. They were very open with how they didn't have much of a budget and how they needed to be smart with their money. Some of my favorite examples that they mentioned were how they talked about reusing assets.
For example, the airlock, which you'll see in the Malevolence where Obi-Wan and Anakin dock, is the exact same airlock that Anakin and Ahsoka docked to Ganak's ship, the Vulture's Claw.
There's another example with the pirates in episode 11.
Apart from Hondo, who is the leader of the pirates, pretty much every other pirate you see is a clone.
I loved hearing how these guys had to navigate all this. Maybe more importantly, however, when you get to the featurettes about the later episodes in the season, they were able to talk about how they got more resources and how they were able to improve in a lot of areas. They often talk about how the graphics improved as the season progressed. They make a comparison about the crash we see in episode 13 compared to the crash in the movie, and how adding smaller details made the crash feel more impactful. They also mentioned how they added little things like the character's breath on a snow planet. They also spoke about how they had more assets during the Blue Shadow virus arc, and how that compared to the beginning of the season. All this improvement just happens in the first season alone. Think about how much they improve on the other aspects of the show as the seasons progressed. So, Star Wars The Clone Wars Season 1? It was alright. It was definitely an improvement from the movie, but there's still a lot of flaws and lots of room to grow. Let's go to the ratings and see what most people seem to think about the season. Season 1 received a 69% critic score from 16 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 78 audience score from over 1,000 reviews. IMDb doesn't give individual scores for seasons, but if you were to average the 22 episodes from Season 1, you would get a score of roughly 7.35 out of 10. The highest rated episode according to IMDb was Lair of Grievous with an 8 out of 10, and the lowest rated episode was Bombad Jedi with a 6 out of 10. Tune back in a couple days to see my breakdown of Season 2 of The Clone Wars. But until then, thank you everybody so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to check the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.